In the name of God, the most revocatively alive, the supreme discloser. I'm back here again with our friend Matt Barker, a brother in the Fatimiyya, a Bayani, and we're going to talk and chat away about the coronavirus, especially what we're observing online in the kind of polarities that that are coming out of people about what this all is about. Hi, Matt.
How you doing, Wahid?
I'm doing good. Uh, Shoot, Matt. I'm all ears.
Well, I wanted to start this up because I'm noticing a trend, and I try to. I'll say just like I told you, but for public record, so to speak. When I'm commenting on social media or not just sharing somebody else's stuff, I always try to come from an angle that I haven't seen before. I try to contribute something unique rather than just repeating an old talking point as if I'm a judge. Uh, and I thought of a lot of things that I was noticing that don't seem to have been commented on. And I know from our private talks that you've got your own thing there too. So I thought we had some good stuff to say to put out to the general public, to whoever wants to listen. That just isn't being talked about. And I think that's a good place to, that to me is a good place to start. And because there's a lot that,
There's a lot. There's a lot to say. I mean, people. I mean, what I'm seeing online, right? And I mean, we saw a lot of this in 2016, in the lead up to the election of Donald Trump, when you had Facebook, particularly, and Twitter just split right down the middle between Clintonistas and Trumpers. A very similar thing seems to be unfolding throughout social media, where you have the government, not so much even the government liners, but people who are going with the mainstream narrative about coronavirus versus, the batshit crazy conspiracy theorists, bioweapons crowd. And, what can one say that none of these camps, at least in social media, the people we're interacting with, any of them are medical specialists. They're not in any kind of a bio tech kind of job, whether in government or otherwise. None of these people are, right? That is not to say that anything that is coming out of the mouth of official experts is necessarily true. But the evidence, and I keep asking this of people who are pushing the bioweapons narrative, is that, look, if you can bring better evidence than what we're reading, either coming from the Chinese government or a lot of this alt media technology, I'm all ears. I mean, if this was a bio attack and there is foolproof evidence to prove that this was the case, then we should see it. We should see this evidence.
There isn't evidence. There's evidence, but not proof. There's suggestions. There's things that might warrant another look.
Yeah, there's circumstantial evidence.
Yeah.
But I think, all of I mean, if one gets sucked down that rabbit hole of these conversations with either camp, I think one is not exercising one's own faculty to discern and find out what actually happened.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay? And put a much larger matrix of causalities together in order to at least have some kind of a lens to understand what we're dealing with, right?
Exactly.
It isn't as if pandemics haven't existed before in human history. We've had pandemics from the dawn of man. It isn't as if since the 1950s, scientists and then environmental scientists have been warning since the 1950s that we were environmentally headed in the wrong direction. Pandemics, climate collapse, that sort of thing is a subject that scientists and environmental scientists particularly have been speaking about publicly since the dawn of the atomic age. And this whole discussion that goes back 50, 60 years needs to be taken on board in any discussion of the COVID-19 and what it may be. I mean, they are getting close, or at least we're hearing the claim that they're getting close to a vaccine. There's been reports out of various university labs, etc. The University of Queensland here in Brisbane claims that they're close to a vaccine, and on it goes. But the narratives about the COVID-19 have become a spectacle in both a Debordian sense and also in almost like a Wagnerian operatic sense at the same time.
Kill the virus, kill the virus.
Yeah. Right? I mean, look, even if you want to look at it from a kind of an Armageddon kind of scriptural point of view, there are many elements of that very much present. But what I'm finding very difficult to get my head around is that, each of these camps is rationalizing, and some of them are rationalizing extremely well. We're seeing a lot of interesting rationalizations come out of these people.
Yeah.
But in the rationalizations themselves, they are not taking into consideration a lot of other factors about what this pandemic may be.
Yeah.
And this is where I have to shake my head, because the issue this time is much more cut and dry, I think, than even the election of 2016 in the United States. And that was only specific to the United States. Let's not forget.
Yeah.
This is universal. This affects the entire planet. Now, the fact is that the way that governments are behaving, and governments everywhere, and particularly in the Five Eyes, has a stench of, number one, orchestration to it. It is as if they were waiting for something like this to come, where they would just lock the entire society down. And then the question asked, then, since that is the case, and we're seeing all this power being clawed by governments everywhere over this pandemic, right? Then this does begin to feed into the suspicions that the conspiracy theorists have about the situation. But we also have to consider the fact, if what we know about the COVID-19, the reality of it is far worse, right? Then what should governments be doing in the face of something like this? I mean, I put this question up there on Facebook. I asked, if you were some kind of a medieval potentate in Central Europe during the Black Plague, how would you approach this plague? How would you try to cease this pandemic, to stop it?
Yeah, it's a difficult question, because I don't think they knew that it was actually spread by a bacteria, even what a bacteria was back then, beyond very getting to the gross point infection. And the idea that it could be spread to another through casual contact, I'm not sure was even known then. So going there, it's a difficult question.
But basic intuition or common sense intuition of most humans in a situation, even in a semi-civilized setting, would mean at minimum that certain number of people who have caught it need to be socially distanced from those who don't have it.
Yeah, well, as far as I know, there has been quarantining, for lack of a better term, for millennia.
Yeah.
Not necessarily even because of knowing of the biology of viruses or bacteria or other germs, but just because someone had a bad spirit and needed to be avoided for a while.
There you go. There you go.
And going back, also the question though, if you're a ruler, one thing that is very almost universal to, for lack of a better term, tribal societies, and I'm not too crazy about that word, as it originally meant uncivilized, but small groups of people working together. Well, they were in fact working together, whereas nowadays, in the face of the colonial capitalist system, you see so much of it being an everyman for himself. And well, there are certainly a lot of people who are wiser than to act that way. There are still a lot of people who, are, especially in the U.S. I'm not there right now, thank God. But you see, all these people calling themselves protesters, but they're just all about their own personal choices rather than, working together for the betterment of us all. And it's unique,
Well,
sick, and childish.
and here's the thing, that I wanted to come at some point during this discussion. Do you get a feeling that less and less people have the ability to kind of reach that conclusion? Now that we have a crisis, let's look at what we want as not just the immediate solution, but a solution to a bigger problem that this is focusing on.
Well, yeah. Well, go into your comment that I know you want to make about who stands to gain from pushing that this is a bioweapon and not a natural occurrence that you and me have talked about before, and I want to take it a step further because I think they go together.
Sure, go for it. Go for it.
Well, you were saying, I'll just paraphrase your words, that we still don't know whether this is, we don't have definitive proof one way or the other, but people are looking at it as if someone says that it is not a bioweapon, that they automatically assume it's just covering it's just someone covering their ass because it was. And of course, not to say that if it were a bioweapon, that pointing that out doesn't have its own political motivations by trying to finger the other guy. But if we really want to ask the cui bono question, and we see people wanting to say, no, this could not be a natural occurrence, then who benefits are, as you have said, who benefits are the capitalists, are the ecocidalists. Yeah. Because as you said early in the podcast, scientists have been talking about this as an issue since the 1950s. Now, granted, there have been some that have taken that and twisted it to their own agendas, just like we see governments doing now, and corporations twisting it to their own agendas. But if we don't acknowledge the possibility that this is something that came out of nature, then we don't have to acknowledge the possibility that as a whole, we have to look at what our relationship to nature is.
Bingo. Look, this is the issue. The finger pointing, in my opinion, is the real conspiracy. Okay?
Yeah.
The finger pointing between the different camps and governments, whether it's the Chinese against the West or the Anglo-5 West against the Chinese, and this rhetoric is ratcheting up by the day. The fact is that this is a smokescreen, and the smokescreen for a very specific reason. If there is a universal admission that this is a naturally produced pandemic, and if this pandemic can then be mapped out to have occurred as a result of this toxic over-industrialized and post-industrialized global society that we've erected, that this is the cause. And that not just COVID-19, but in the future, more of these things, far worse, may land upon the doorstep of humanity, then there needs to be a concerted effort at that point of realization that the system that we're living under needs to be dismantled in order for us to survive as a species. But
exactly.
The myopia of the current power brokers and the current power players of the planet is so limited and so small that they would prefer to keep the game going on indefinitely than to make that admission that business as usual is responsible for unleashing this sort of viral monstrosity. And this is only the first shot if we don't take the corner. if we don't turn around, if we don't make the U-turn, if we don't look at other novel ways of sustaining ourselves as a species on this planet without this system of capitalism. They will never do that. So and this is the banality of it, that they would even take themselves to a point of a physical war, as happened in the Second World War, rather than to admit that what they're doing is incorrect, and not only it's not only detrimental to the humanity and everything here, but also ultimately to themselves and their own progeny.
Yeah,
they won't do that.
Yeah,
they will point
to expand upon that point, though, in terms of like the psychology of it, even whether, I don't know if maybe incorrect is the right term so much as immature.
Yeah, look, let me read that post I put up on the 2nd of May. Right?
Okay, sure, go for it.
Okay, I'll read it. I have a better conspiracy theory regarding COVID-19 than much of what is presently on offer. For decades, biologists and climate scientists have indicated that pathogens and viruses from the last ice age, and even much, much older than that, remained dormant, perpetually trapped in ice and within ice molecules in glaciers and icebergs located at the poles, north and south. Is it possible that rapid climate change and the rise of global temperatures has melted glaciers and icebergs containing such pathogens and viruses that may have made contact with, let's say, penguins, seals, and any other similar animals, who then transmitted a proto-SARS-COVID virus through a chain of other animals that became affected, and then jumped from animals to humans before mutating in Wuhan, and maybe elsewhere before that into the COVID-19? Is it also possible that this transmission migrated through 3 primary vectors that then mutated into 3 different strands of the virus, namely the ones that they claim originated in Asia, in the Middle East, and North Africa, and Europe, which is why we appear to have 3 different forms of the virus, with some suggesting even more than 3. Why cannot people think in these terms in social media?
Yeah, and because even if you're given a very specific scenario that may or may not be the case, the idea that, something about our relationship to nature is just plain fucked, and we have to confront that. I want to go also to like a psychological level here, expanding on your point, though. Like I said, it's what we're seeing is, to me, immaturity. And one of the things, it's a matter of, will the world grow up or not? And, if we take the sham that we call liberal democracy, that was popular, that what, got revolutions fought and things in its name and all that was the promise. As Richard Wolff likes to say, the promise of, to use the French revolutionary terms, liberté, égalité, fraternité, liberty, equality, brotherhood, and yet social democracy and capitalism as we know them has done anything but. It's, if anything, it's kept, it's kept a system of haves and have-nots in a big way. And what I see going on is, people want to go back to normal, or even if they don't want to go back to normal, they think some things need to be tweaked. They still think there's a simple cure. Look at the push for a vaccine or a drug to solve this. Which so goes into our current culture of just finding simple solutions. Now, hey, if you can find simple solutions to certain problems, great, but oftentimes it's not so easy. But it's, again, it's take a pill or get a shot and everything's okay. No, I don't think that's the case.
Well, number one, we got to remember that, and this is coming from people I'm talking to, whether on Facebook, Skype, or elsewhere. These are people with their ear to the ground to the scientific community. They're saying you know, um, best case scenario, we will not have a vaccine until probably the beginning of 2022.
Yeah. Which is quicker than any vaccine's been developed before, and they never successfully developed one for SARS-CoV-1.
Nope. So that's number one. Number two, this means that we aren't going back to normal. And number one, normal was the problem.
Yeah, exactly.
Normal got us here. This is time out. And seriously, I mean, I hope governments are reflecting on the possibility that they need to take a decisive action on this issue of the ecological destruction of this planet, to stop any future such pandemics breaking out on this place. And it's as simple as that. And if that requires dismantling the current global economic system that we have, then this is what must be done.
Yep. One of the reactions that I've seen, I'll take one particular scenario that seemed to be common, although there's a lot of them. There was and it goes back to the wanting to, I think it's a symptom of just wanting simple solutions when they don't exist, rather than mature into the people necessary to bring about the more complex ones. One of the videos that went around trying to just say, oh, it's overhyped kind of thing, were these two doctors out of Bakersfield, California. Now, I initially got, and I've seen this posted in my timeline or in comments in my timeline easily 5 or 10 times, and the red flags went up immediately for me. Especially when they called them, that they said they were doing it from a, quote, ER physician and entrepreneurial point of view. I guess maybe they own that little clinic and still work in it, but that was highly questionable to me. Not to mention the fact that they were, at around I shut it off at the 9-minute mark, but somewhere around the 8-minute mark, even their cameraman is asking unscripted questions with the what the fuck subtext. And what I did see, they weren't talking at all about medicine. They were talking about, just math and statistics, and it was not very good math. Now, a phenomenon that I saw repeatedly that no one else seems to have picked up is that, someone would post this, and obviously people would criticize, knowing that something is wrong here. Now, what I saw also repeatedly happening was people calling out the people who were criticizing it as, well, with the simple line, how do you know you're not a doctor? And true, they weren't. However, usually the people making the call-outs, myself included, had more knowledge than the people, sneering at us, you're not a doctor. And it's kind of the equivalent of a 5-year-old sniveling at an 18-year-old, well, their 18-year-old sibling, well, you're not mommy or you're not daddy. And so in a sense, it was perpetuate, this just wanting to go back to normal if we can just find someone to agree with, us, however full of shit they are. To me, it was very much a childish thing. I'll make an analogy. I'm not a mechanic. If I would have no clue what to do to, say, fix a head gasket, even if I know what a head gasket is. I have, however, over the course of my life, I haven't actually had my own car in a while, so I haven't had to worry. But over the course of my life, I have switched alternators, starters, distributors, fuel pump. Even once, even though I never actually switched a radiator, jury-rigged one with a leak when I was on a cross-country drive with JB Weld and sheet metal. and I had to repeat the process a few times during the trip, but I got it, I got it there so I could go to a trusted mechanic friend and get it done much cheaper than X shop would do and probably ream me. Now I can, again, I'm not a mechanic, but I was able to learn some things and do some mechanical repairs. Yet when you see these people making this commentary, wanting to believe any person with a certificate, regardless of how nutball a thing they may be saying, to me, that's just a retreat into childhood.
Well, look, man, knowing scientific methodology, and the discipline doesn't matter.
I do.
Yeah. And which you do. The discipline not matter. When you understand the methodology, you know when an interlocutor or a speaker is speaking factually, generally speaking,
yes,
or unfactually.
Just the way I know whether or not even a mechanic with a lot of certificates is hosing me.
Yeah, same thing.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean that one has to buy into everything these people are saying.
Exactly.
Right.
Yep.
One has to be very discerning about everything that is being said, but then one has a duty to then weigh all the narratives on all these nitty-gritty details, rather than to jump to the conclusion, oh, this is a government plot, or oh, this is a bioweapon attack, and on and on and on and on it goes. I find it interesting that at least the people in social media that I'm encountering do not want to accept the premise that there is a possible natural locus to this, for a simple reason is that they may actually be led down, down the road of having to accept some form or accede to some point about the sentience of the Earth.
Yeah. Well, it's also a particularly lazy thing if we don't have to change our relationship with nature. It can, if we insist that it is a bioweapon, we think the solution is nothing simpler than, oh, let's just stop having these biolabs. And there might be a good argument for that one, but that doesn't change, where we, how we need to grow, how we need, or in a lot of cases, how we need to shed, some very old dead skin that we call, colonialism, imperialism, capitalism, etc.
Indeed. But, there are interesting things unfolding, in terms of, I think some of the disconnect amongst people is also pulling a lot of people, or unplugging a lot of people, as it were, from buying one or the other narrative. And there are people who are now thinking in very novel terms about what comes next. I'm not talking about governments. I'm talking about people talking on each other's walls, etc. So there's also a lot to look forward to here. But what I would insist is that people take a more vigorous methodological point of departure about their own thinking.
Yes.
About these issues, and if they can do that, and they can be discriminating, they can also reach their own conclusions. And if there are more and more and more sincerely honest conclusions, whether on a lay level or on a professional level, I think we then will have a much better gauge about where we go from here.
Definitely. I'll add a few things on the on the maturity scale, because if people want to know, my education in terms of how I know about about scientific methodology. My degree is in psychology, and even though I went into it, hoping to be a counselor, and realized that maybe not such a good idea, given the fact that you have to either not help, but just merely socialize to an already bad system, poor people for very little money, or you can potentially get rich by hosing rich people who don't really have any problems that compare to the constant stressors that poor people face. I ended up not going into counseling, although I did learn things, such as, that actually was the start of my foray into occultism when I said, okay, I want to learn some counseling skills. I guess I got to practice. So I took up reading tarot, initially as a smokescreen to get people talking, even though when I started doing readings, I started scratching my head and going, hey, there's something to this shit. And I've been reading cards for 15 years now. But during undergrad, because academic psychology is got such a hard on for wanting to prove itself a legitimate science, that but because they're dealing with things that are less tangible and easily measurable and quantifiable than your average biologist or chemist or physicist, that you learn backwards and forwards scientific methodology, and because you have to learn how to operationalize your variables. You have to learn questions of reliability, questions of validity. So as a result from that, I can look at articles talking about scientific studies and know immediately whether it really was peer reviewed or not, despite the claim, the article claiming as such. And there were definitely times in undergrad where, of course, because teachers, they're busy folks that might not have enough time to, do things as thoroughly as they want to. There were plenty of times where professors would give the class articles, from peer-reviewed journals, and say, okay, well, your assignment is show how they have demonstrated proper methodology, et cetera, et cetera. And myself and a lot of others would be back in class the next day going, well, it looks like it doesn't fit these standards of peer review. And, it turns out, the professor didn't take the time to fully read the article themselves. And when, they took a further look at it after their questions, they're like, yeah, you're right, this is bad research. So that was a big disillusionment, I think, for a lot of us with the scientific community. And then as I got more political, you could kind of connect the dots and think, well, that sometimes, sloppy research is allowed in for the sake of financial expediency. And so a lot of people have not really studied, they've made science, for lack of a better term, they've made science their religion, in a very fundamentalistic sort of sense where, that person is a scientist.
Which goes fundamentally against the very methodology of science itself. This is the
exactly
hilarious part about these new atheists, is that their dogmatism is actually counter to the very scientific method that they claim, at least, to espouse.
Yes.
Because it negates skepticism about the conclusion that there is nothing.
Right.
I've tried to pin a lot of new atheists on this point many a time about this logical fallacy in their thinking, and they just run away.
Yeah.
Or like Dennis Gueron, they become Roman Catholics. They convert to Catholicism from new atheism overnight. Yeah.
Which is one of the most authoritarian religions on the damn planet.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, that's really making Pascal's wager right there.
Yeah.
But yeah, this is the issue with a lot of these folks. But some of these environmental scientists that I'm talking to here and there on Facebook, elsewhere, email, they are cautiously optimistic about this. But like me, they're trying to point out the political ramifications, the long-term political ramifications, and the possible capital that genuine, scientific conservationists have been advocating to governments for a good 30, 40, 50 years. That now may be the time for that hearing, as it were. So this is the feedback I'm getting from those folks. But these governments themselves and their media apparatuses on all sides, I got to say, people need to disengage from these, from both sides, literally.
Yeah. Well, I think it goes back to we as Bayanis, as the Fatimiyya, we acknowledge that not only the Ba, but that prophets essentially were what, for lack of a better term, we'll call occultists, even if maybe that's not the right word. It's, if we look at that, occult just means hidden.
They're all theurgists. That's the word.
Theurgists would probably be the better word you're looking for. The idea that your relationship to the divine is your own, and you have even though it may not necessarily be the definition of a theurgist, one of the necessary components is just kind of owning your own adulthood and your own power. Just the way when I took up Tarot, even though I was doing it at the time, not really thinking it had anything, I was just, using it as a smokescreen, only to find out, hey, there is something here. I took it up because I wanted to understand more about counseling and get to talking to people, which it worked to do very well. And I found there was something to it. I had, despite not at that point having, sheepskin, I decided it doesn't matter. I'm going to learn about this. I'm going to figure some of this shit out on my own. Which is not to say that I don't take a lot of cues from a lot of other people who I do consider to have some expertise. But in the end, it's up to me to not only decide for myself, but take the responsibility of helping others and contributing something to future generations. Mm-hmm. And what I see, among a lot of these, for example, people who want to get back to work, it's not really, it's very insular.
They're looking at it from the perspective of their upset routine.
Yeah.
And obviously, loss of income.
Right.
But it is insular because they're not seeing the bigger picture. Is that there's something going on here right in front of you, right? That requires your attention far more urgently than your concern about your income or lost income, and what motivations governments may or may not have.
Right. If we look back to tribal society, though, okay, there was a clear cut, because even though puberty has been around, since people have been around, adolescence, as we know it, is a relatively new thing. Before then, you were a child, you went through a hazing ritual, you were an adult. And, as the adult, you are supposed to produce more than you consume, unlike the child, as one of my good buddies would say. The thing is, in tribal societies, it wasn't that a parent strictly hunted for their children. It was that all the adults worked together to hunt or farm or whatever for all the children as well as themselves, in the tribe, in the village. Whereas people who just want to go back to work, they want to provide, but it's for just their mini unit, which, the family is a unit, but you can't have a society of one family. so there's a huge, you know, to you put, you know, missing the big, you know, even in the wanting to go back to work to provide, it's still in a sense it's still in a sense a very childish viewpoint. You know, because they're seeing and if anything, they're seeing a job as a you know, as allowance 2.0 rather than taking responsibility for a contribution to humanity as a whole.
Because just let's remember that postmodernism has atomized individuals.
Yeah.
In the pursuit of their own thing. And you know, I mean, this was a topic that Guido Preparata put his finger on in the book, The Ideology of Tyranny. And he you know, at the end of the book, he actually draws the conclusions that, you know, what this kind of you know, ideology does is fragment the possibility of any solidarity. And with your average, you know, with your average herd mentality, they're not going to think in those global terms.
No, they're not even going to think in national or communalistic terms.
No, their concern is immediate themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which might be fine when you've got a broken leg and want to patch it up, but beyond that, it's a real dead end.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a real dead end.
And you can see how they're really not getting. To me, one of the ways we can see how people really aren't getting it being about something much greater is just how many of these so-called protesters won't wear masks, as if, you know, as if that's a you know, sort of, you know, a sort of unfair restriction. Yet, you know, they're wanting to go back to work where they are probably, you know, a lot of jobs require you to wear a uniform, which will not even, now some of which won't even be necessary if it's a matter of wearing something with the corporate logo on it, when you're in and if you're not even interacting with the public who need to know that for whatever business to go. Yet at the same time, there are also, you know, as we were talking about earlier, there are, you know, oftentimes some aspects of uniform are practical. You know, soldiers wear camo so that they blend in and don't get shot as easily. People wear hairnets in restaurants so that hair doesn't get in people's food. You know, there are parts of uniforms that are not just corporate. You know, when you're a kid, you often, you know, when people, you know, when kids, you know, dress up for Halloween, they're always dressing up as someone older. They're pretending, you know, like most childhood play, they're pretending to be an adult. Another little thing I stole from a buddy of mine. But, you know, when you see this, you know, but the reality is that, you know, certain aspects of how you dress have, you know, aren't fashion but are practical, and it's just basic adult common sense to go along with that. I mean, I wear a swimsuit when I go swimming because it's not very comfortable wearing my dungarees in the water. And, you know, it's a simple, you know, masks are not, you know, simple facial surgical masks are, you know, they're not an encumbrance. I went for a jog last night in one. It's not a big deal, but it's an it shows extreme childishness to ignore such practicality.
I agree 100%. You know, and it's also, I think, conflating defiance to the state with basic common sense and etiquette and reciprocity. You know, these are separate things, but in the politicized landscape of the modern West, the population, for some reason, seems to often conflate these two.
Yes.
When these are different things.
Agreed.
And that's why in conservative politics, it's always, it's always about the shifting of blame to those in power, etc. Um, but what's going on, what's interesting about the COVID and what it's doing is that it is also exposing that mentality to certain people.
Yeah.
More and more. We're becoming aware of how limited and how toxic ultimately that general herd mentality is.
Oh, yeah.
And that we do need to, in fact, basically shut these people up. If we can't do it rationally, then you need a good kick up the backside.
Oh, yeah.
Because the behavior is extremely petulant rather than being constructive.
Yeah.
And it stems from, a sense of entitlement that then it is not ready to reciprocate to other people elsewhere, even in its own backyard, whether they be, African Americans or Native Americans or Latinos, if we're talking about the United States, or others,
Yeah.
And that is all becoming exposed, and it's really, the people who are still clinging to dear life in that narrative of the world are just falling on their ears. But what I find interesting is that these people, again, are exposing themselves. That rather than have a rational voice to tell them, okay, maybe you need to tone it down here a little bit, and send everybody back into their homes, that right now isn't the fight that they should be fighting, that the fight that they should be fighting will come at the point where government is taking too much power away, using the pandemic as an excuse, not the pandemic itself.
Yeah. Well, and also, it's
When you
not
reach
just.
that point of reasoning, then you have a more mature approach to how to tackle the problem. And that, this is one problem. It needs to be tackled. The government is another problem that needs to be tackled in its own space.
Yeah, well, another thing, a point you often like to make that I think is relevant here is it's not just the government, but the power structure nowadays is the corporation.
Exactly. This is
And
something that
and in a
people
sense,
don't get. Yeah.
they're wanting to go back to the corporation being their daddy.
Yeah. Who created the problem in the first place? And
Yeah.
who essentially is the real leaseholder and the puppeteer of government
Yeah.
everywhere.
Yeah, and yet they're not, and yet people were government ideally, even though it often gets bought out, is, and it's frankly right now, it's about, some government is the only thing in a lot of situations, unless you have something like a strong union or even a mafia. A government is, in theory anyway, what is supposed to be something that can intercede between the individual and the corporation. Now, they fucked that role up a lot. I don't think that needs explanation. But it's funny that people, whereas it's the corporation that is ultimately responsible, that is in a lot of ways responsible for their misery. Government, not that they haven't fucked it up enough plenty, but has become their scapegoat rather than growing into the maturity of seeing who, really is pulling the strings and facing that problem head on.
Well, if they do, then a great element of the American worldview, the American Weltanschauung, as the Germans call it, the worldview, that will fall apart.
Yeah.
And Americans have been brainwashed for well over 100 years against any form of proper social thinking. They don't want the American public to wake up to the fact that there is no social contract in the United States between government and population, that many moons ago, the government basically pulled its social contract from the population and made a social contract with the corporations.
Yep.
And so it is not we the people in the United States and in the liberal capital world, it is we the corporations.
Yeah.
When that sinks in, that this is the reality, that government is composed by corporations and not the people, when people begin to see that, then at that point something can be done. But in the United States, there are so many proverbial poison pills ideologically in that country against people reaching that kind of conclusion that I doubt very much that the American public ever will.
Yeah, at least not without a whole lot more pain and suffering, unfortunately.
Yeah. Unfortunately. Doesn't have to be that way.
No,
but when when you have a clown like Donald Trump as your president, and that support does not seem to be waning amongst his base, where his base still kind of look at this guy in the Google-eyed way that they look at him, America's doomed.
Yeah, well, what was particularly sad to me during his when he actually thought that UV light could be intense enough to kill a virus without burning the living shit out of the skin on its way in, or think that you could somehow inject disinfectants to kill a virus without killing you, which I mean is just, you would hope that at that point, he would have lost some supporters.
No,
even if he did, but even if he didn't lose supporters, no, it seems like no one could come for. There was no one who was, a dump supporter who could at least say, well, I still support him for X, Y, and Z, but man, he fucked up on that one. Instead, you just had people doubling down.
Yeah.
About how he really didn't say it or didn't he didn't say drink, he said inject.
Yeah, well, it's kind of like the behavior of our friend Gomer, he put up that ridiculous blog about Joseph Mossad, got criticized for it, took it down. I criticized him, made a podcast about it, and he puts it back up again 48 hours later with even dumber commentary than the one that he took down.
I still haven't seen that new one, so I got to read it for a good laugh.
Man, it's a scream. It really is a scream. That coupled with what he put up, that whole space thing that he put up.
Yeah.
That was just like, okay, well, this is it.
That's another whole whole potential psychoanalysis podcast, but I don't think we really have to do that one. Well, gotta look at that one for themselves.
Actually, no. Let's do that. It's not a podcast. I will let you in the last 20 minutes do your psychoanalysis of Dale. I've given my 2 cents. Stephen gave his 2 cents. I want to hear what you have to say. Go for it.
I'm going to actually go, they're not quite pedophilic, but I forget the word, liking teenagers kind of.
Epiphilia.
That's just obvious. But on race elements, this is someone who calls himself, not racist and yet constantly says things that are, and as near as I could tell, he just took the pictures and created a story about it, including naming the characters. Now, this was, manga pictures, Japanese anime, which I'll admit to not being particularly well versed in. But what I do know about it is that oftentimes these animators are drawing characters that are supposed to be Asian, even if they are often depicted having lighter skin. Now, granted, because that was the case in Asian, we can talk about the classism that is kind of inherent in there is a totally different issue. But there has, for even since before Asians ever met Europeans, a lot of various cultures have fetishized white skin and things like that. But nonetheless, when Japanese anime artists draw these lighter skinned characters, they are still nonetheless Asian, and they want the characters to be viewed that way. And yet Dale gives this character a totally, European name. So, and doesn't even seem to think about and that shows that he probably knows even less about anime than I do, which is not a whole lot. I'll admit I'm not really into much of it, but the fact that he doesn't even know that, just looks at the initial skin tone and doesn't realize that these are nonetheless usually supposed to represent Asian characters, and automatically puts his whiteness onto the character. Now that shows some, deeply subconscious racism on his part.
It's always been pretty obvious to me that is the case with Dale Husband.
Oh well, yeah. When he started when I used some Spanish cuss words at him, and he said, I'm not Hispanic, don't talk to me that way. And at the same time saying he wasn't a racist, I'm like, okay, I give up. I don't really, that's the kind of thing where you don't really need to say anything. Granted, I went back at him with some more Spanish lingo just to get under his skin, but
just remember, he is from Texas, man.
Well,
that is a very divided community.
Oh yeah.
It is the South.
Oh yeah. And urban Texas is a heck of a lot blacker than a lot of people like to think it is, too.
Yeah. I've been to Houston, Dallas, Austin when I was living in the United States. Yeah, I know. I've been there a few times. So I know exactly what you're talking about. But keep going.
No, that was my main takeaway on that. Just again thinking that somehow if you can put a childlike mind into an adult body, that makes things okay. No.
No, it doesn't make it okay.
No.
It just demonstrates that there is a deviancy at work that is deeply rooted psychological disorder and personality disorder.
Yeah.
And it is. I find it very interesting that all of these trolls, whether we're talking about Dale Husband or Abukira and Giron, always tend to project what they are against their nemesis, and they've done this many times. It comes out as the gaslighting.
Oh yeah, yeah.
But when someone like Dale Husband writes what he wrote, and just basically spotlights, or rather, the spirit has spotlighted this extremely dark spot within Gomer. It kind of makes you wonder, Dale Husband, if you're listening, man, maybe it's time to walk away, and go reflect on your life.
Well, during this time because even though things are opening back up, even in places where they can get away with it, it still doesn't mean you should rush into it, and it doesn't mean you don't, use it as a time to reflect. So people should be taking a cue there. I think maybe, even though we're, running out of time here on this one, I definitely think there's a whole, there's material for a future podcast, every bit as this one or longer, on because even though, sexual abuse is an extremely serious issue, I definitely think we have material for a whole nother podcast on the hype of targeting Hollywood as a bastion of pedophilia. And I'm not to say there aren't plenty of them there, but the way that is being used as a hype point while ignoring how prevalent this has been for millennia.
Main Street. Yeah, in Main Street itself.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. I mean, it is to me. I'll just, I'll let this be a teaser for another podcast I hope we can do about how this is a controlled operation psyop.
Mm. No question about it.
Or I should say a controlled opposition psyop. But yeah.
Anyway, let's end on that. No, this was a good conversation. We'll do a couple more hopefully soon, and we'll leave with that. لا حجة إلى أليا قبل النذير.